If something doesn't change and I feel like this next time, I'm not playing volleyball again. I've been playing volleyball since I was 12 years old. Since then, my life has practically revolved around it. I played it nearly every day when I was in high school. I went to university in Sheffield for the volleyball program there. And I've spent the last 2 years living and playing volleyball in Sweden, also I could keep playing at a higher level. So why did I nearly quit? Twice. Short answer, the first time was because I didn't physically think I'd be able to play again. And the second was because I was getting so anxious before every game that I didn't really think it was worth playing anymore. How did I get to that stage? Well, keep watching and I'll tell you. A brief aside before it's story time. I've said a few times on this channel that honesty and transparency are really important to me when making these videos. A big part of my goals in making these videos is I want to encourage people to see where volleyball can take them by showing where it's taken me and how enjoyable that journey's been. However, I wouldn't be doing that responsibly if I didn't also show the less good bits, hence making this video. Okay, so a bit of background about me that will add some much needed context. Growing up, I was extremely lucky and never really had any mental health problems. I never felt depressed and I didn't really understand what it was exactly or how it differed from just being sad. And then with anxiety, which is kind of what plays me now, so it's quite funny to look back on. I remember thinking when people talk about feeling anxious, like I actually just don't know what anxiety is, like I don't get it. Yeah, it's really weird to think back to now. But anyway, obviously I felt nervous for things. If I was going to ask a girl out or go on stage for something, I'd feel that pit in my stomach, but it never felt disproportionate or like it didn't make sense. I'd never be ruminating thinking, oh, what if this and what if that? I kind of just be like, well, yeah, obviously I'm a bit worried about that, and then I'll crack on. Then some context with volleyball. So I grew up playing in Norwich, where I was very much a big fish in a small pond. I was captain of the junior teams that I played in when we entered the National Cup, and maybe a bit too fond of the sound of my own voice, but definitely I wasn't shy. And aside from that, I was just really desperate to play volleyball, and I didn't care what the level was or what level I was at. I remember when I just first started playing, and I'd been playing a few months, so I was in the development league, like the lowest rung of volleyball in Norwich, and my older brother Peter was playing in the mixed league, which was the level above. And I'd go along to watch him, and I'd bring my kit along, knowing or hoping that someone would get injured or not turn up, and that then I'd be able to play, even though I was in way over my head. But that's just how desperate I was to play, and I wasn't worried about the level or that I wasn't good enough. I just wanted to play. As I got older and started playing NVL for Norwich, I didn't lose that confidence when I started playing senior volleyball. I always felt comfortable and like I belonged. If anything, I felt like I could be doing more. The highlight of my time playing volleyball in Norwich came when I was 17, when my friend Zach and I won the Norfolk Volleyball Association Indoor 2v2. And this was like the big event in the Norwich-Norfolk volleyball calendar. And winning that really cemented, in my head at least, that we were at the top of our game for 17-year-old English volleyball players. Now, in hindsight, obviously that is unbelievably naive and stupid, but in my defense at the time, I didn't really have many reference points. We weren't involved in the England junior setup because at the time there were no open trials and we didn't really have a coach on the inside to get our foot in the door. So the only time we really crossed paths with other people our age playing volleyball was playing National League, but there were very few juniors playing NVL in Div 3, South East or whatever else we were playing. Anyway, a year later, I rocked up to Sheffield Uni, and now it was time to be a small fish in a very big pond. Suddenly, I was surrounded by people who didn't just play for the England juniors, but played for the England seniors, people who were going to go on to play professionally, and even some people that had played professionally. Naturally then, I got humbled extremely quickly. And it was the first window into feelings of insecurity on a volleyball court, or like I didn't belong there, or put differently, imposter syndrome. I didn't really know why at the time, but for the first time, the thing that I'd looked forward to more than anything in my week, which was playing volleyball, was the thing I was dreading most in my week, trainings and games. Interestingly though, as a brief aside, even though the level was the same when I was playing Bucks for my university, because we were in Bucks Prem, I never really felt these feelings when playing for the uni team. It was only when playing NVL and training with both universities and some of the other senior players. I don't really have a theory as to why this is. If anyone wants to put their armchair psychology hat on and let me know in the comments, I'm all ears, because I'm not really sure. But either way, I thought it's an interesting data point. Anyway, fast forward to my 4th year of university in Sheffield, and by this point I've settled nicely into training, generally look forward to going, but honestly I'm still shitting bricks before games. I remember the first game of the season that year, we were playing away to Bologna. I was just buzzing to have made the first team, not being the second team this year. And then when Keith, our coach, read out the starting lineup and he read my number, I remember being unbelievably disappointed and my heart sinking because I realised I was going to have to actually play now. A far cry from where I was in Norwich as a 13-year-old, bringing my kit along to high-level games because I was just itching to be able to play. As the season progressed though, I did start to feel better and better before each game, getting to the stage where I was disappointed not to be playing rather than the other way around. Around the midpoint of the season, I spoke to Keith and asked him if he thought if I had another year in Sheffield that I'd be good enough to then go on to play for England or play professionally overseas. And he said yes. So that was now plan A. Finish degree, get job, train and have 1 more year in Sheffield, ready to go overseas. We had a few more games to go before the end of the season. We were hoping for a top 3 finish when all of a sudden...
The Prime Minister has announced the most drastic limits to our lives that the UK has ever seen in living memory.
So, when the pandemic hit, I moved back home to Norwich to be with my family during lockdown and unfortunately brought COVID with me. Now, the initial spell of COVID that we had wasn't really that bad. If I didn't know COVID was a thing at the time, I would have thought I just had a bit of an odd cold. The real kicker, though, was what came afterwards. Long COVID. Obviously, I had my degree to finish, so that took up most of my time, but I generally wasn't that active aside from doing this. After the initial illness had passed, we gave it a couple of weeks, and then Dad and I, who'd been ill as well, decided let's go for a really gentle run, start exercising, start moving again. And then we got home, felt fine. Next day, felt fine again. Day after, completely wiped. Unfortunately, this pattern would repeat and only get worse with time, where it would get a delayed tidal wave of fatigue after any amount of exertion. The amount of exertion needed to trigger this fatigue would get less, and then the severity of the fatigue would get worse. Add to this some brain fog, and you've got yourself long COVID. It got to the stage where, at its worst, I remember one time popping out with some fresh air, just walked to the top of the road about 500 meters and getting really panicky that I was going to have to phone someone to come and rescue me because I didn't think I'd be able to walk back home. And this coming from someone who, obviously, a few months ago was a student athlete, working out in the gym every day, training volleyball, playing every day, 5-6 days a week. These were the physical symptoms. And unfortunately, for me, a really big part of long COVID was also anxiety. I very quickly learned what it means to feel anxious. I felt so ill most of the time. The main thing I was worried about was something else making me feel ill. So this is where most of my anxious thoughts were going. I remember, for example, that I was really scared of eating because I was worried, it was all in my stomach and that's where I felt ill. So I just didn't eat most of the day. I had like one meal a day. So someone who was already pretty skinny, that's obviously not brilliant. I think I lost 12 kilograms from what my normal weight at the time was. So that's not great. The other tricky thing is that we didn't really have a clue what was happening. We got COVID relatively quite early, so in March 2020. So there weren't that many people ahead of us with long COVID to have then recovered and shown us what to do. The NHS, understandably, given the circumstances, were also a bit clueless. When I spoke to the NHS, I eventually got diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and the specialist that I spoke to said, don't worry, 1 in 10 people make a full recovery, which obviously not particularly reassuring. Finally then, and I think this is more of an indirect consequence than directly because of long COVID, I experienced depression for the first time in my life. I think this is basically because I didn't have the energy to do anything and didn't have any belief that this was ever going to change. Sitting around the house all day, scared to eat anything or do anything for fear of being ill, with no energy to exercise and too much brain fog to even pick up a book, kind of gets to a man. I started taking antidepressants, which did help a little bit, but to be honest, it still wasn't great. I'd signed for the house in Sheffield before the pandemic hit, so when the tenancy rolled around, I moved back up north to Sheffield to live with my friend Sando. At this point, I'd basically given up on trying to play volleyball. There weren't really any signs I'd be able to play properly at all, let alone go on to actually play professionally. I remember this experience watching the football when I'd see a player, run box to box and be bent over double, out of breath, panting because they're so tired from what they've just done. Watching it with this sort of pain and longing in my stomach, as well as feeling a bit ill, just from thinking, I can't do that. I'll never be able to do that again, to push myself to the limit, to take a set to failure. So this is the first time I quit, for want of a better word. I didn't give up completely, even though I didn't really have much hope. I did still keep working. So I'm nothing if not a man with a plan. So my plan was to keep working on my recovery, of course, but otherwise sack off volleyball, actually use my degree and try and get a grad job in engineering. So day to day, I spend my time doing some part-time tutoring just to keep the lights on and food on the table, and then applying for jobs and doing my recovery. I won't go into massive detail about my recovery for long COVID and what I did, how I structured it and so on. But if you are someone who's struggling with long COVID, please do reach out. I am more than happy to help. In brief, my understanding of long COVID is basically that there's nothing wrong with your body, and that if you have an MRI or a blood test, it's not going to come up with anything. Of course, your symptoms are still real, but what's happened is your brain is sort of stuck in a loop of trying to protect you from something that's not there anymore because you've recovered from the initial infection. And it's your brain's attempt to protect you from something that's not actually there that causes you to be so hypersensitive to everything. And then naturally, it's very draining to constantly be in this sort of fight or flight state, which is why you feel so fatigued all the time. So basically, you need to reprogram your brain, for want of a better word, to tell it to just chill out, everything's okay, I'm not ill anymore, you can relax. So my approach, and I was very fortunate to be going through all of this with my dad, as he sadly had long COVID as well and was suffering actually more than I was to basically throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. So anything anyone said, this might help or this helped me, we thought, sod it, we'll try it. So we were meditating, we were getting acupuncture, talk therapy, cold water exposure, breathing exercises, whatever. Things that, to be honest, a lot of those previously I would have sort of had my STEM engineering hat on and dismissed as woo-woo shite. I was like, well, no, I'm trying it. And between all those things, can't point to exactly how much it was this, how much it was that, we started to get a lot better. Towards the spring of that time in Sheffield, so now into 2021, I was able to start exercising a bit again. I remember being overjoyed the first time I could take a set of push-ups in the garden to failure. My work capacity steadily improved until I was able to get to the stage in Sheffield where I thought, right, I can have a realistic crack now of having the season I wanted to have pre-COVID to use as a springboard to then go off to play pro. However, my work capacity was still pretty limited. Putting in a normal day's work to earn some money and then trying to train and go to the gym on top of it was too much for me, and it would leave me floored for a few days again. So I had to be very slow and careful the amount of work I could do. The way this basically works then, and sadly it still does now, though to a lesser extent, is basically the total amount of work or energy I can put in a given day is that it's just way less, right? So like a normal person my age could put in this much effort and I can put in this much. But then also it's the case that if I dig deep and, sort of burn over that for a couple of days in a row, then I crash, and I crash hard, and I'll be quite reliably just very ill for a few days and can't really function. So this is the physical picture then. I could train hard enough to be able to play volleyball and make progress and hopefully go on to play pro. I had to be careful, but it was manageable. Question is then, how was I feeling mentally? Now that I was back on my feet and doing things day to day, the depression had completely cleared up. I'm really lucky to say that I've never really struggled with a bout of depression like that again, so that was really good. Anxiety-wise though, I was a complete head case. As it relates to volleyball, this is now my 6th year playing in Sheffield, so I felt pretty okay going to trainings, but when it came to games, despite being the captain of the first team, I was still unbelievably anxious before games, more anxious than I'd been before any game I'd ever played. I remember one time my parents were out visiting and they're coming to watch me play, and we were playing Durham at home, and I said to them before the game, like, if I feel like this next week, if something doesn't change and I feel like this next time, I'm not playing volleyball again. Like, this is unbearable to feel like this for something supposedly I enjoy, or I'm committing my time to not working a proper engineering job so I can then go off to play pro to do this every week. I'm not doing that. Like, I feel terrible. That begs the question then, what on earth was I so worried about? Honestly, I don't know. It wasn't really clear what my anxious thoughts were or what I was ruminating about. I wasn't really worried that I'd play badly or that we'd lose. I was sort of just worried. I don't really know why. I obviously had some problems with insecurity and imposter syndrome, which would explain why I felt so anxious when I first started playing in Sheffield. Putting my armchair psychologist hat back on then, my theory for all this would be that when I first started playing in Norwich, I derived my sort of sense of self-worth as an athlete from being good compared to my peers, because generally speaking, that was the case. And then I came to Sheffield and all of a sudden that's been shattered because I'm not that good compared to my peers. In fact, I suck. They're all way better than me. But then you'd assume now I'm the captain of the first team and I'm the big cheese again, that I'd be feeling great. So how come I feel worse now than I ever have in my entire life? The answer then, to me fairly obviously, is that long COVID either had or was really messing with my head. So I went into that Durham game thinking this will probably be the last ever volleyball game I play at this level. I think I then got unbelievably lucky that I then had a really good game by my standards and really enjoyed myself. And the stark contrast between the feeling I had before the game to being really gutted we lost, not because we'd lost and we needed the points, but because the game was over and I wanted to keep playing. This was massive to remind me why I play volleyball in the first place. Once the game got going, I felt like that little kid again, just buzzing to be playing volleyball and be on court. And although it was obviously far from a silver bullet, it did really refill my motivation to not give up on volleyball and try and solve my problems. So I kept doing just that. I kept up with my recovery, which by this point was mostly meditation to try and deal with the long COVID stuff. And then I started reading and thinking way more about sports psychology to try and tackle the imposter syndrome and the underlying issues I had predating COVID. Then over the next few years, my physical health did continue to improve so that I've been able to work pretty bloody hard at times for quite a long sustained period. The time I had in Sweden whilst working and playing is definitely the hardest I've ever worked in my life. I still don't think I'm at 100% and maybe never will be. And I do still sometimes crash pretty hard without having really done all too much, but it's still so much better than where I was at my worst. Mentally, it's still a bit of a roller coaster. I can have months where I kind of forget anxiety is even a thing, and then seemingly out of nowhere, I can be hit by a wave where it makes me feel like I have to dig really deep just to leave the house. The difficulty as an athlete is, aside from this headspace obviously not being conducive to performing your best in a competitive environment, it's also very tiring. That's the added spice then, that the physical and the mental are really heavily linked. I get tired way more easily than I should, and when I'm more tired, I'm more prone to anxiety and things rattle me more easily. And then on the flip side, obviously being anxious all the time is really exhausting. Constantly overthinking and ruminating at things is very draining. And then obviously, again, as an athlete, this makes it much harder to work hard in training, to hit the gym afterwards, to recover properly. More recently though, whilst playing both in Sweden and for England, I've had some of my best ever moments on the volleyball court in terms of enjoyment, the level, everything. But as much as I'd love to say this all has a happy ending and, I'm cured, the last few years playing in Sweden and England, unfortunately, I have still had moments where I felt so shit and anxious before a game. I've had really serious conversations with myself about quitting and really questioning, is it all worth feeling like this? And yet, I didn't quit. I haven't quit, and I don't think I ever will. Because ultimately, no matter how anxious I feel before the game, as soon as I step on court and actually start playing volleyball, I don't want to stop. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm always in the best headspace on court. Sometimes I can still be playing quite timidly, intensely, and not playing with the joy and confidence and being a leader that I know I can do. But no matter what, the joy of playing volleyball has always won out, and I think it always will. And that more or less brings us up to date. It's still an ongoing journey, but at the time of writing, I'm in a pretty good place, although obviously this is far from over. I'll continue to talk about my mental health and how it relates to sport and volleyball in future videos, but I really wanted to make this one to give a bit of context to when I talk about that in future, especially as the next video, which will be about my time with the England team and career. Everything I've talked about here really shaped and played a big role in my experience there. A few closing thoughts then. Firstly, with long COVID specifically, if that's something that you do struggle with and you want some help or advice, then please do reach out. I'm more than happy to go into loads and loads of detail about what I did with my recovery. Secondly, going forward in future videos, I'll always be talking about my mental health and anxiety and these sorts of things. But if you want to see any videos specifically where I really go into how I've dealt with imposter syndrome and anxiety, any of the tools I've used or things I've read that have helped me, then let me know in the comments. And that's something I can think about doing. Otherwise, that's all I've got to say on this for the time being. I hope this didn't come across as too self-pitying, but like I've said before, it's important to me to try and be honest in these videos and really open up about my experiences. If you found anything I said in this video helpful, then please feel free to leave a like, or if you can relate to anything I've talked about, then feel free to let me know and share your experiences in the comments.